When talking about D&D, there is a subject that is often brought up, and we've brought it up many times on this channel, and that subject is villainy. Villainy is a big part of the D&D equation. D&D is a game where we spend a lot of time delving into dungeons and slaying monsters, and in many campaigns, the DM is working the party towards a BBEG, a big bad evil guy, a central villain for the plot. And that means that DMs want their villains to be compelling. They want their villains to be good. They want their party to hate their bad guy and work to take them down. And that can be kind of difficult. There's a reason why there's so many how to make a great villain D&D advice videos out there. I think we've made 2 in the past, and for good reason. It is an important topic to talk about. However, there is a piece of advice that I see floating around all the time. Constantly I see this piece of advice, and it is definitely not my favorite piece of advice out there on the interwebs. And that advice is, you need to make your villain sympathetic. And now I want to say, this isn't terrible advice. This isn't bad advice. It's okay advice. The principle of sympathetic villain equal good is not completely flawed, because that is a way you can make a really compelling villain. We've seen plenty of sympathetic bad guys in film and in literature that have been phenomenal and amazing. However, I disagree that it's a requirement. In fact, I disagree that it is the best way to achieve a good villain. So today, I want to present to you a revision of this advice that will allow us to clearly paint a path towards having a good villain, and at the same time show you a place in fantasy where having a sympathetic bad guy has gone horribly wrong, or at least trying to have a sympathetic bad guy has gone horribly wrong. It's gonna be a lot, so without further ado, let's get started. Alright, let's start out with why sympathetic villains are good and where they can go wrong. Sympathetic villains are good because it makes the villain a little bit more engaging. When the heroes can see the villain's perspective, it creates a bit of a moral quandary. The villain is still a villain. They're doing something antagonistic to the party. They're doing something that the party wants to stop, or they're trying to stop the party from doing something that they want to do, and therefore the party must defeat them. But if the villain is sympathetic, that creates the quandary of, okay, we understand what this guy is coming from, but we still need to stop him. You have to weigh those options, and yeah, it makes your story a lot more interesting and engaging. My favorite example that I can come up with off the top of my head would have to be Killmonger from Black Panther. We've got the second movie coming out, so the first movie's been on my mind. And yeah, Michael B. Jordan's Killmonger was really well done. He was well performed, he was well written, and I think he was a really good sympathetic bad guy. He had believable motivations, and while the audience saw his perspective, they also saw that he was still a villain. He was still doing something antagonistic to the protagonist of the plot, aka the Black Panther, aka T'Challa. He needed to be stopped, but that moral quandary created some interesting moments, interesting dialogue, and made the plot more interesting in general. I don't think that movie would be nearly as good without Killmonger in the picture. However, now that we see why this can be really great, where can this whole thing fall apart? Well, the problem lies when the villain's sympathetic nature isn't sympathetic to the audience. One reason Killmonger was good was because when the film was trying to make us sympathize with him, it generally worked. People did sympathize with him. His motivation was believable. But what happens when that step falls apart? Well, you get a villain who is clearly trying to be sympathetic, but is failing, and honestly, that doesn't just make them hateable, it's worse, it makes them annoying. And that's where we get back to World of Warcraft Shadowlands and Sylvanas Windrunner. So, I know I've already talked crap about World of Warcraft Shadowlands in a previous video where we talked about the BBEG of that expansion, aka Zoval, but I think Sylvanas illustrates perfectly why forcing some kind of sympathetic angle can be disastrous for your story. I know that neither of these are ttrpgs, but they're both villains, and I think we can learn from both of them. Sylvanas, at least in later expansions of World of Warcraft, was pretty evil. She did a variety of very, very evil things, was responsible for a lot of people not only dying, but being condemned to a horrible eternal afterlife, which is pretty evil on her part. However, Blizzard tried to push a sympathetic angle with her. Yeah, she did all of these very, very horrible things, massacred thousands of people, but, she did it in the name of freedom for the realms, freeing us from this horrible machine of existence, or something along those lines. It was very convoluted, and on top of that, people just didn't care. The convoluted thing didn't help with that, but it just didn't really make any sense. She's fighting for freedom, but at the same time, she's fighting with a guy whose primary power is literally called domination.
Oh, really? Really?
And yeah, I know the poor writing thing is probably the main problem here, not necessarily the fact that we're trying to make her a sympathetic bad guy, but it does showcase where this could go absolutely wrong. I think if they had just stuck to making her bad, it still would have been a little bit boring, but at the same time, it would have been way better than what we got, where they try to force a sympathetic angle, and it just doesn't really work out. It annoys people, it pisses them off, it's not great. And I actually think that D&D is especially susceptible to this. Look, when you are playing D&D, you're playing with a group of players and you don't know everything about them. You don't know what's going to vibe with them, so to speak. You don't know what they're going to find sympathetic. And actually, more importantly, you don't know what their characters are going to find sympathetic a lot of the time. This means that often DMs kind of need to work around their players. However, when creating a sympathetic bad guy, that means you sort of have to play a little bit of a guessing game. And if it doesn't work out, if you still try to force the angle, it can really fall flat with your players. I made this mistake in my first campaign. I tried to make a sympathetic bad guy. It fell flat with my players. They just didn't care. They really hated the dude. And it just felt really forced and weird and wrong. So, in summary, I think D&D is especially susceptible to a lot of the problems and pitfalls that sympathetic villains can fall into when they're done wrong. Now, again, it's not a completely bad angle. A sympathetic bad guy can absolutely work, you just need to do it right, and maybe that's a video for another time. However, I don't think that's the only way you can make a villain good. My revision to this advice is rooting it down to its core. What goal is making a villain sympathetic achieving? What are you doing by doing that? Well, I think you're making the villain interesting. That is what you need. You need your villain to be interesting. Somehow. Let's get into how. Look, there are plenty of bad guys out there, and I would argue that a lot of the most famous ones aren't sympathetic at all, which is why it baffles me why this advice is so damn common. Look, Sauron in Lord of the Rings is not sympathetic. Hell, let's go back to the prequel of that series, The Hobbit. You think Smaug is sympathetic? He's a giant dragon that hates people and wants to eat them and just have gold all the time. He's not exactly a sympathetic bad guy. He's just kind of a dick. Actually, sticking to giant dragons, let's jump into D&D itself. One of the most famous D&D villains is Tiamat, a giant evil dragon, this time even bigger and with even more heads. She's not exactly the greatest being in the multiverse. She's pretty evil. Her worst sin is forcing me to read Hoard of the Dragon Queen. That was a terrible thing that I did not like. She's not sympathetic in any way, is my point. And guess what? She's still a fine villain. You're not gimping your campaign by using Tiamat in it. So what makes these villains work where other villains fail? Well, first and foremost, there is beauty in simplicity. Sauron, Tiamat, Smaug. These villains are good because, in part, they're pretty simple. They are bad guys doing bad things. And while some people might think that that's basic, it's not bad in any way. They are bad. They are pretty bad, but it's not bad for your story. Sauron is anything but boring. He's got a giant army with interesting powers, a variety of minions to challenge our protagonist. That itself is cool. His presentation in both the books and the films is interesting. And that brings us to one of our first points, and that's going to be presentation. Like Megamind has said many times, presentation is important when it comes to a villain, and in D&D, I would argue it's very, very important. Look, D&D is an imaginative medium, and your imagination is powerful, but providing your players with something to hook onto, something to visualize, that is very helpful. It doesn't need to be an elaborate Matt Mercer-style mini, but it has to be something. It could be a description. It could be a voice if you're into voice acting. It could be a picture that you pulled up on Google. That's a personal favorite of mine. Look, it could be anything. Your players need to visualize your villain somehow, though, even if it's down to just theater of the mind description. You need to give them something to hook onto. Appearance is a big part of villain. Presentation is a big part of villainy. It's a part that can be forgotten in D&D just because we are spending a lot of time in our imagination, but having the villain present themselves in a villainous way could be very good. This also helps if you want to go at that aforementioned sympathetic angle. I mean, if you want your villain to be sympathetic, you need to present those sympathetic traits, whether it be through a monologue or just straight up through their appearance. But this presentation thing doesn't just need to apply to the villain. In fact, all of these tips don't need to just apply to the main BBEG. It's also important to remember the villain's little minions. Those little guys are also important. And a big part of what made Sauron so interesting was the presentation of his minions. I mean, who can forget the imagery of the 9 Nazgul riding in on the fell beasts of Mordor? That was amazing. That was epic. That was great. And yeah, D&D may not be a visual medium, but if anything, that kind of takes off some restrictions on you. It allows you to describe a variety of things to hook your players in and make your villain all the more engaging. Another way to make your villain interesting is to tie them into your players. This one is even bigger than the last one, and I know this one is hard for one reason in particular, and it's a reason that I have fallen victim to as well. Look, a lot of us plan our BBEGs in advance, way in advance, a lot of the time before we even know who our player characters are going to be. I do this literally in every single campaign I've ever done. I've done this. I've always planned out the BBEG in advance, except for one time. In my second home game, Descent into the Veil, I did a brief campaign diary covering the first couple arcs of that campaign. In that game, I did not figure out who the BBG was until like halfway through. I had no idea who it was going to be. I had hints in my mind. Obviously, it was going to be a powerful figure, but I mean, depending on who the players ended up becoming, that would determine the BBEG. Originally, I saw the indecision as a weakness in my DMing. I saw it as a flaw. I thought I was making a horrible mistake. I was being lazy. But now I realize that delaying setting my BBEG in stone was one of the best things I did for that game, because it allowed me to choose a BBEG after the party made their own choices in the game that led them to this person being the bad guy. Spoiler, it's Vecna, by the way. The BBEG is Vecna, which, yeah, isn't the most roguish choice, certainly, but choosing Vecna as the BBEG was a major choice. Vecna was actually just going to be a cameo, but the party were so invested in that story, I just decided, to hell with it. Let's make him the big bad evil guy. Let's make him the culmination of this campaign. I think that really worked out, and there's nothing wrong with delaying a little bit. However, you don't need to do that. You don't need to take that route. If you want to, you can just shift your BBEG a little bit. You're the DM. You have unlimited power in this world. You made this character, or at the very least, you're controlling them. You can change their motivation. You can change their background to fit in better with the players. Now, I don't think you should be too obnoxious about it. I do think it can kind of stretch credulity when every single player has a mysterious backstory and every single one is tied in with the BBEG. But you could do this to at least a couple of player characters. It could create some interesting connections between them, and it allows them to create a believable rivalry with the bad guy. And also, bad guys hurting player characters does not need to just happen in the backstory. It can also happen during the game. Have BBEGs knock players out, torment them, mock them. I mean, that's really gonna piss your players off if you do it right. Break magic items if that's the kind of game you want to run. Kill player characters if that's the kind of game you want to run. Have your BBEG actually do something to the players that is meaningful. The Vecna in my campaign is a very duplicitous little weasel dude. He was defeated hundreds of years ago and now scurries to gather back his power. And he manipulated the players big time, and yeah, that pissed them off. They really hate this guy. My Vecna also mocked them a lot. He would constantly torment them, verbally, because, I mean, he can't really physically do anything to them at this point. But he would verbally torment them all the time, and yeah, they did not like him. He would kidnap NPCs that they liked just to toy with them. And that all developed into a very palpable hatred that the party have of Vecna, which is good. They're engaged. They care about this guy. I mean, they care about killing him. They want to take down Vecna very badly, and that is amazing for your campaign. That's exactly what you want. Look, my Vecna is not sympathetic in any way. However, that doesn't make him any less of a villain because my players care about him. They care about taking him down, and that is all that matters. As long as your players are engaged, if they think your villain is interesting, that is going to make your game all the better. Look, the sympathetic villain angle is a good one. It can work, but thinking it's the only path to victory in creating your BBEG is not the way. There are many ways to create a great villain, and I hope that this video helped you to find some extra ones. If you guys want to see more villain advice, I've done a couple videos on them. I'll link them in the cards if I remember. I probably won't. But in any case, if you enjoyed this video, then please do leave a like. If you want to see more of my content, then you can check out Shadow for Kerkonos. The end of our campaign is coming. The 2-part finale is upon us. And if you want to check that out, it's linked in the cards. And while you're there, subscribe to Crispy Tavern to get more of our content right as it comes out. And finally, if you want to leave your own tips or thoughts, go down to the comments down below. If you can't think of a comment, leave the comment interesting to let me know you made it to the end of the video. And that's like, comment, subscribe. I'll see you all next time. Farewell.